I moved to the city of Vesperine because I was promised it would change my life. Fresh out of college, drowning in student loans, and desperate for an escape from my monotonous hometown, Vesperine seemed like the perfect new beginning. The city was shrouded in mystery, far from the tourist trails and completely off the beaten path. When I told my friends and family where I was going, most hadn't even heard of it. "It's a ghost town, isn't it?" my brother teased before I left. I laughed it off at the time. A ghost town? Vesperine had a population of over 200,000 people, thriving industries, and a cultural scene I'd heard was on the rise. The articles I found online painted it as a hidden gem, a place full of art galleries, underground music scenes, and a deep, storied history. It sounded too good to be true, and it was. The first thing I noticed when I arrived wasn't the bustling nightlife or the vibrant art scene I'd read about. Instead, it was the emptiness, the silence. Vesperine wasn't a ghost town in the literal sense. There were people, sure, but something about the atmosphere felt vacant, hollow. The streets were unnervingly quiet for a city of its size, and the people I did see seemed to glide past me, their faces distant, their eyes glazed. I chalked it up to culture shock at first. I'd been living in a rural town, so naturally, the urban environment would take some getting used to. But after a few weeks, the unease only grew. The city felt wrong. Vesperine was a place where the light never seemed quite bright enough, where the air carried a chill no matter how warm the day was. Every building, no matter how new, seemed weathered and aged, as if they had stood for centuries, weathering storms of time I couldn't comprehend. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that bothered me. It was the people. There was something off about them. They moved slowly, dreamlike, as if they were detached from reality. Even when I walked into a crowded coffee shop or a bustling market, there was a strange stillness. Conversations were quiet, subdued, barely more than murmurs. No one made eye contact. The city had a strange habit of making you feel isolated even in a crowd. I remember the first time I tried to strike up a conversation with one of the locals. It was at a corner bookstore that I'd stumbled upon while wandering the maze-like streets of the city's older district. The building had an ancient charm to it, with creaky wooden floors and shelves that stretched to the ceiling. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman, her hair thin and silver, her face gaunt. I approached with a book in hand, something about the history of Vesperine that had caught my eye. "Excuse me," I started, trying to sound friendly. "Could you tell me more about this book? I'm new in town and I'm curious about the city's history." She looked at me, but it was as though she wasn't really seeing me. Her eyes were clouded, distant. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, just stared. Then, finally, she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible over the faint creak of the store's old beams. "There are things in Vesperine that are better left forgotten." I waited for her to continue, but she didn't. Instead, she turned away, as if the conversation was over before it had even begun. I stood there, feeling an awkward chill crawl up my spine, before quietly paying for the book and leaving the store. That encounter stayed with me, and it wasn't long before I started noticing more and more strange things. It started with the sounds at night. At first, they were subtle, distant, muffled noises that I could barely distinguish from the usual hum of the city. But they grew louder over time. Footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Whispers in the stairwell. The sound of something dragging across the floor in the apartment above me, even though it had been vacant since I moved in. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings make noise. Cities are loud. But that didn't explain the sensation that came with it. The undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone. Then came the nights when I'd wake up suddenly, the air heavy with an oppressive weight. My bedroom would feel darker than usual, the shadows longer, deeper. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, unable to move, the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. It was as though something was watching me, something I couldn't see, but could feel. It would press down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. One night, I finally gathered the courage to look around the room. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something out of place. The curtains by my window were moving, ever so slightly, as though something had brushed past them. I held my breath. A cold draft swept through the room, chilling my skin. But the window was shut. I was sure of it. Slowly, I sat up, trying to shake off the dread crawling through me. Maybe I'd left the window cracked open earlier in the day and forgotten. But as I approached the window, I saw something that froze me in place. Handprints, on the inside of the glass. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my heart hammering in my chest. They were faint, as if someone had pressed their hands gently against the glass, just long enough to leave a mark. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but there wasn't one. I hadn't had anyone over. I hadn't touched the window, and yet, the handprints were there, undeniable and chilling. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my room, my back pressed against the wall, eyes wide, watching the window, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The handprints remained, but the room stayed quiet. Over the next few days, the city seemed to close in on me. The feeling of being watched became constant, no matter where I was. The noises at night grew louder, more persistent. I stopped leaving my apartment after dark, too afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows. But even during the day, the streets felt dangerous in a way I couldn't describe. It was as though the city itself was alive, and it had noticed me. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed by an alleyway I hadn't noticed before. The buildings on either side were taller, casting long, dark shadows across the narrow passage. I should have kept walking, but something drew me to it. The alley seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. I hesitated at the entrance, peering into the gloom. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure, standing just out of reach of the fading daylight. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. No response, but I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, a primal instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step into the alley, my feet moving against my will, drawn by something I couldn't understand. I took another step, then another. The shadows swallowed me whole. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, the figure. At first, it was just a shape, barely visible in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at a person, or at least, something that looked like a person. Its form was twisted, hunched over, as if it had been broken and put back together wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty. Black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure stood there, watching me, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. And then, slowly, it began to move towards me, its steps jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. The door slammed shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But even then, I knew I wasn't safe. Whatever was in that alley, it had followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home from the alley. The figure with its hollow eyes, that twisted body. It haunted my thoughts like a bad dream. But this wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that it had all been my imagination, that I had let the atmosphere of Vesperine get to me, the truth gnawed at the edges of my sanity. The city had become a labyrinth of fear. I started avoiding that part of town altogether, taking different routes to work, keeping my head down when I walked past dark alleyways or side streets. But the more I avoided it, the more it seemed like the city itself was bending around me, trying to lure me back. I'd catch glimpses of the alley from the corner of my eye, even when I was miles away. It would appear in the reflections of shop windows or as a fleeting mirage when I turned a corner. No matter where I went, it was there, watching. The noises in my apartment grew worse as well. Every night, the sounds of footsteps, dragging, and whispers became almost unbearable. I could hear them just outside my bedroom door, as though someone, or something, was pacing the hallway, waiting for me to fall asleep. The handprints on the window had never faded, and new ones began to appear. Sometimes, they would be smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed their face against it, breathing heavily. But the worst part was the dreams. At first, they were just unsettling flashes of the city. I'd find myself wandering the streets of Vesperine, only it wasn't the same city I knew. It was darker, the buildings taller and more twisted, their windows black and empty like the eyes of the figure I had seen. The streets were lined with shadowy figures, their faces obscured, all of them watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the weight of their stares lingering long after I had opened my eyes. But as the nights passed, the dreams became more vivid. I was no longer just wandering aimlessly. I was being led, pulled deeper into the heart of the city, to places I had never been before, places that didn't exist on any map. One night, the dream led me to an old, crumbling building that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. Its facade was cracked and weathered, vines creeping up the sides, choking the life out of the structure. The windows were all shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets, and the door hung open, swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. In the dream, I hesitated at the entrance, but something compelled me to go inside. I stepped through the threshold and immediately felt the air grow cold. The interior was a decayed ruin, the floorboards rotting beneath my feet, the walls covered in strange symbols and markings. I couldn't read them, but I could feel their weight pressing down on me, as though they were watching me as closely as the figures outside. As I moved deeper into the building, the feeling of dread grew stronger. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I had the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. There was something in the darkness ahead of me, waiting. I woke up just as I reached the center of the room, but the fear didn't fade when I opened my eyes. My heart was pounding, my skin slick with cold sweat, and the air in my bedroom felt just as heavy and oppressive as it had in the dream. I glanced at the window and froze. The handprints were gone, but in their place there was something far worse. Written across the glass, in what looked like smears of dirt or dust, was a single word: Come. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through me. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking, and rushed to the window, wiping the glass clean with my sleeve. But the word was etched into my mind, seared into my brain as if it had been written there with fire. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it had been a prank, or that I had imagined it in my half-awake state. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The city wanted something from me, and whatever it was growing impatient. The next day, I couldn't concentrate at work. My co-workers were all the same: cold, distant, uninterested in conversation. The people of Vesperine had always been withdrawn, but now it felt deliberate, as if they knew what was happening and were willfully ignoring it. Every time I tried to engage someone, they would avert their gaze, mumble a response, and walk away. It was like talking to shadows. By the time I left the office, I was on edge. The sun was setting, casting the city in a deep orange glow, but even in the fading light, everything felt wrong. The streets were emptier than usual, and the air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. I hurried home, my pulse quickening as I passed by the usual alleyways and darkened storefronts. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, every figure that passed too quiet, too still. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to look too closely at the buildings around me. But as I approached my apartment building, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Standing at the end of the street, barely visible in the dimming light, was the figure from the alley. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. Even from that distance, I could sense the emptiness of its eyes, the cold void that waited behind them. I wanted to run, to turn and flee in the opposite direction, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in its stare. Then slowly it lifted its hand. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted towards my building, my breath ragged, my feet pounding against the pavement. The door to my apartment seemed miles away, and with every step, I felt the weight of that thing's gaze pressing down on me, as if it were right behind me, reaching out to touch me. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. My back pressed against the wood as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to process what I had seen, what had followed me. But there was no time to think, because the sounds had started again. This time they were louder, closer. I could hear the dragging noise outside my door, the slow, deliberate scrape of something being pulled across the floor. My entire body went rigid, my ears straining to pick up every sound, every breath. The footsteps followed, soft, careful, but unmistakable. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside. I could feel the air shift, as if something was standing there, just inches away from me. Then, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the door, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body frozen in place. Another knock. This time it was harder, louder. The door rattled in its frame, as if whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. I forced myself to take a step back, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. Then another step. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But just as I turned to run, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the apartment. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was thick, suffocating, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. I stood there, waiting, listening, and then I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable. A whisper that seemed to seep through the cracks of the door, filling the room with its presence. Come. It wasn't just a word. It was a command. The room seemed to darken around me, the shadows growing longer, deeper. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness fraying as the voice repeated itself over and over. Come, come, come. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside my head, echoing through every thought, every corner of my mind. I stumbled backward, tripping over the furniture as I desperately tried to escape the voice, but there was nowhere to go. It was everywhere. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. The figure, standing in the corner of my apartment, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. It had found me. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the figure that had somehow entered my apartment without making a sound. It hadn't moved yet, but its presence filled the room like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. The figure's black, hollow eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if it were studying me, waiting for the right moment. The voice in my head had stopped, but I could still feel its echo reverberating inside my skull. My pulse pounded in my ears, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from those eyes. The figure began to shift, slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. Its limbs stretched and twisted as it stepped forward, one agonizingly slow step at a time. The room seemed to shrink around it, the walls pressing in, suffocating me in their closeness. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, locked in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a low, guttural rasp, like the scraping of metal on stone. And yet there was a strange familiarity to it, as if I had heard it before in my dreams. You! It rasped, its voice sending a shiver down my spine. You do not belong. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled backward, crashing into a table and sending a lamp tumbling to the floor. The noise shattered the oppressive silence, but the figure didn't react. It kept moving toward me, its body contorting with each step, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I don't... My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I was shaking so badly I could barely think, let alone form a coherent sentence. You brought yourself here, the figure hissed, its voice echoing through the room like a distant storm. Now you cannot leave. I backed into a corner, my hands grasping for something, anything, to defend myself, but there was nothing. The figure was getting closer, its eyes drilling into me, stripping me down to my core. I could feel something inside me unraveling, a deep, primal terror that I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. It reached out a hand, a long, bony appendage with fingers too long, too thin to be human. The air around it seemed to warp, bending toward the creature as if drawn by some invisible force. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to move as the figure's fingers brushed against my arm. The instant it touched me, my world exploded into darkness. I woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was dark, too dark, and the air was thick, stifling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, but the memory of the figure, the hand, the voice, it all felt like a dream, a nightmare. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't in my apartment. The walls around me were stone, cold and damp, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The floor beneath me was rough, uneven, and the air smelled of earth and decay. My stomach twisted in knots as I pushed myself to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. I was underground, somewhere deep beneath the city. The memories came flooding back all at once. The figure, the knocking, the voice. It hadn't been a dream. The thing had touched me, and now I was here wherever here was. I stumbled forward, my hands trailing along the cold stone walls as I tried to find my bearings. The tunnel I was in stretched into darkness in both directions, and I had no idea which way to go. But staying still felt like the worst possible option, so I started walking. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for me to stretch my arms out fully. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with moisture and the stench of something rotting. Every sound I made seemed to echo off the stone, amplifying the scuff of my shoes, the shallow breaths I was taking. I felt like I was being swallowed whole by the city itself. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light ahead. My heart leapt with hope, and I quickened my pace, desperate to find an exit. But as I approached, I realized the light wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from a door, a massive, iron door set into the stone, its surface covered in more of those strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The symbols were familiar, though I didn't know why. They looked like the ones I had seen in my dreams, the ones that had been carved into the walls of that decaying building. And as I stood there, staring at them, I felt a terrible sense of recognition wash over me. I had been here before, in my dreams. This was the place the city had been leading me to all along. My hand moved toward the door of its own accord, my fingers brushing against the cold iron. The instant I touched it, a shock of cold surged through me, and the symbols flared to life, glowing bright enough to illuminate the entire tunnel. I stumbled back, but the door remained closed, unmoving. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, unsure of what to do next. But before I could make up my mind, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the tunnel. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned, scanning the darkness behind me. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was coming. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled toward the door, my hands searching for a handle, a latch, anything that would let me open it. But there was nothing. The door was smooth, seamless, no visible way to open it. The footsteps were getting closer now, and with each step, the air seemed to grow colder, thicker. I turned back toward the tunnel, my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But as soon as I took a step, I saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the light, just out of reach, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but I could feel its presence, looming over me, suffocating me with its gaze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was stare back, helpless, as the figure slowly lifted its hand and pointed toward the door. For a moment, I didn't understand. But then the door began to open. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as the iron door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black void on the other side. The air that poured out was freezing, biting into my skin like the touch of death itself. The figure didn't move, didn't follow, simply watched, waiting. The message was clear. I was supposed to go through the door. I hesitated at the threshold, my body trembling with fear. Every instinct screamed at me not to go in, not to take another step. But I knew, deep down, that I didn't have a choice. The city had brought me here for a reason, and there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the door. The instant I crossed the threshold, the world seemed to shift. The cold became unbearable, sinking deep into my bones, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but I could feel something around me. It was like the air itself was alive, pressing in on me, watching me. I walked forward blindly, my hands outstretched, searching for anything solid. The ground beneath me felt like stone, slick and uneven, but I couldn't see where I was going. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, loud and frantic in the silence. And then, without warning, I stumbled into something. It was a wall, cold and rough under my fingers. I traced its surface, following it as it curved around me, forming a circle. I was in a room, a small, circular chamber carved into the stone. And in the center of the room, there was something. A figure, hunched over, barely visible in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was sitting on the floor, its back to me, its head bowed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. I didn't want to get any closer, but something drew me to it, something I couldn't resist. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, all hunched over, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were seated in a perfect circle around the chamber, their limbs contorted in unnatural ways, as if they had been left here for centuries. The air was thick with decay, the stench overwhelming. And then, as if sensing my presence, the figures began to move. The figures stirred in the darkness, their movements slow and deliberate, like something waking from a long, dreamless sleep. My body locked up, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood frozen as they shifted, the creaking of their twisted limbs echoing through the chamber. I could hear their breathing, now shallow, wet gasps that filled the air with the scent of rot. One by one, they lifted their heads, their faces still obscured by shadow. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them watching me, tracking my every breath. Panic surged through my chest, choking me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The chamber was small, the walls pressing in from all sides, and the door I had entered through was now gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving me trapped. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the slick stone floor, and that single movement seemed to trigger something in the figures. They began to rise, their bodies jerking unnaturally, as though their joints had forgotten how to bend. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature dropping until it was painful to breathe. And then, they started to whisper. At first, it was just a low murmur, indistinguishable from the sounds of their ragged breaths. But as the whispers grew louder, the words became clear, soft, sibilant voices that filled the room, surrounding me from all sides. Come, come, come. It was the same word that had haunted my dreams, the same command I had heard in my apartment, in the streets of Vesperine, everywhere I turned. The voices overlapped, weaving together in a terrible harmony that sent a shiver through my bones. The figures moved closer, their whispers growing more insistent, more desperate. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away until I hit the wall. Cold stone pressed against my back, trapping me, and my hands scrambled along the rough surface, searching for a way out. But there was none. Why did you come?" one of the figures rasped, its voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. It was closer now, stepping out of the shadows, and for the first time, I could see its face. or what was left of it. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over a skull that seemed far too large for its body. Its eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to draw in the darkness, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, gaping grin. Decay clung to it like a second skin, its flesh rotting away in patches, revealing the bone beneath. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my mind reeling in terror. The figure cocked its head to one side, as if studying me, and the others followed suit, their eyeless faces all turning toward me in unison. "You should not be here," the figure said, its voice filled with something that resembled pity. "You do not belong." I wanted to scream, to beg for my life, to tell them that I hadn't meant to come here, that I didn't know what I had done. But before I could make a sound, the figure stepped closer, its rotting hand outstretched. The others began to move as well, their whispers growing frantic, their movements more aggressive. The air was thick with decay and fear, pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel their hands reaching out, brushing against my skin, cold and damp like the breath of the dead. I was suffocating, drowning. Just as the figure's hand closed around my arm, there was a noise. A loud, metallic clang echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of grinding stone. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the figures froze, their heads snapping toward the far side of the room in unison. The wall directly across from me began to shift, stone grinding against stone as a hidden door slid open, revealing a passageway bathed in a dim, flickering light. The figures recoiled, hissing in the darkness, their movements jerky and violent as they backed away from the light. I didn't hesitate. With the last of my strength, I tore myself free from the figure's grasp and ran for the open passage. My legs felt heavy, my body sluggish, but fear pushed me forward.